The year is 1184 and Japan is on the edge of a transformation that would shape its history for centuries to come. The era of emperors who sat at the center of ceremonial power, poets and courtiers who filled palaces with elegance, is slowly giving way to the age of steel and discipline. On the battlefields of this time, the future is being written not in ink but in blood, not in court poetry but in the clash of blades. This is the moment when the idea of the shogun begins to emerge, when warriors who once served in the shadows step into the forefront of Japan's destiny. Imagine the countryside, castles on hills, banners flapping in the wind, riders galloping across the plains, where loyalty is both a shield and a trap. The great families of Japan are no longer content with whispers at court. They are taking their ambitions to the battlefield. The Minamoto and the Taira, two powerful clans, stand at the heart of this story. For decades, they had competed for influence, playing the game of politics in the imperial palace, trading marriages and earning titles. But by the late 12th century, rivalry had hardened into open war. This was the Genpei War, a conflict that tore across the archipelago and left scars that would not fade. The Taira had held power in the court, using their ties to emperors and their naval strength to dominate. Yet the Minamoto, exiled and beaten in earlier struggles, had returned with vengeance burning in their hearts. Their struggle was not just about control, it was about reshaping how Japan would be ruled, and by whom. By 1184, the war was reaching its crescendo. The Taira had suffered losses and the Minamoto brothers, Yoritomo, Yoshitsune and Noriyori, were seizing the moment. Yoritomo, the eldest, was not simply a warrior but a strategist, a man who understood that lasting power came not from one battle, but from building systems of loyalty. From his stronghold in Kamakura, far from the glitter of Kyoto, he envisioned a new kind of rule, one where warriors would be bound directly to him, forming a government of the sword. His younger brother Yoshitsune, by contrast, was the embodiment of the heroic warrior, daring, brilliant, reckless. Together they represented the two faces of the rising samurai world, discipline and valor. In this age, the term shogun began to take on new meaning. Technically, it had been used before, a title for generals commissioned to pacify distant tribes, but in 1184, it was no longer a temporary assignment. It became a symbol of something larger, the authority of the warrior class itself. As Yoritomo expanded his influence, he claimed powers that once belonged only to the emperor and his courtiers. He commanded armies, managed land, and settled disputes among his vassals. Though the emperor still sat in Kyoto, cloaked in ritual and tradition, real power was beginning to drift eastward, into the hands of men who wore armor rather than silken robes. The battles of this year show how sharp the change was. Yoshitsune's victory at the Battle of Ichi no Tani in 1184 stunned the Taira. Using daring maneuvers, he led his men down steep cliffs in a surprise attack that crushed the enemy's position. It was not just a victory of arms, but of imagination, a sign that the samurai way of war was about innovation as much as brute force. Stories of Yoshitsune's exploits spread quickly, woven into legends that painted him as a near mythical figure. Yet behind the glory, there was tension. Yoritomo, wary of his brother's fame, began to see him as a rival. In the shadows of triumph, seeds of betrayal were already being sown. Away from the battlefields, life for ordinary people was shifting too. Peasants who once paid taxes to imperial officials now found themselves answering to samurai stewards. Land, once managed through aristocratic estates, began to be parceled into fiefs controlled by warriors. The language of loyalty shifted, from service to the court to bonds of fealty sworn to a military lord. It was in these ties, written in blood and duty, that the future feudal order was born. For the first time, Japan was becoming a land where political legitimacy rested on the strength of warriors. The rise of the shogun did not mean the emperor vanished. Instead, a dual system emerged. The emperor remained a sacred figure, a divine symbol whose presence gave legitimacy to rule, but the shogun, backed by samurai, controlled the levers of power. It was as if the nation had two suns, one shining with ritual brilliance in Kyoto, the other burning with military authority in Kamakura. This delicate balance would define Japanese politics for centuries, a dance between the spiritual and the martial. In this moment, the culture of the samurai began to crystallize. Armor was not just practical protection, but a canvas of identity, marked with family crests and symbols of loyalty. Swords were carried not merely as weapons, but as emblems of honor. The code that would later be called Bushido was still taking shape, but its essence, courage, loyalty, discipline was already visible. To live as a samurai was to live under constant tension, where failure was shameful and death could come at any moment. It was a world that demanded both ferocity and grace. The people who lived through 1184 could not have known just how enduring these changes would be. For them, the war was immediate. Hunger, burning villages, families divided by clan loyalties, yet from the chaos a structure was emerging. When Yoritomo was later appointed shogun in 1192, it was not a sudden invention, but the natural conclusion of what had already begun in these years. By 1184, the future was already visible. Japan would no longer be ruled by poets and courtiers alone. The age of the sword had arrived. Still, even as the shogun rose, stories of Yoshitsune carried a different lesson. His brilliance on the battlefield could not save him from suspicion at home. His eventual fall at the hands of his own brother revealed the darker side of the samurai age, that power was fragile and loyalty could turn into rivalry. The rise of the shogun was not a story of peace, but of constant struggle, where bonds of honor were tested and often broken. And so, the year 1184 stands as a turning point. It was the moment when the idea of the shogun shifted from a temporary title into the foundation of a new political reality. It was the year when the Minamoto pushed the Taira to the brink, when Yoshitsune's genius illuminated the battlefield, and when Yoritomo's vision began to reshape the nation. From that point forward, Japan's destiny would be carried not in the silken sleeves of courtiers, but in the steel of the samurai. The world of the shogun had begun, and it would cast its shadow over the land for centuries to come. The year was 1274, and the winds that swept across the seas carried with them more than salt and spray. They carried omens, whispers of something vast and terrible coming from the west. In the islands of Japan, life had its rhythm. Farmers tending to their fields, fishermen casting their nets, monks chanting in wooden temples. Yet even in the hum of daily life, there was unease. Word had travelled faster than ships, that a force unlike any the world had seen was on the move. A tide of horsemen who had trampled empires beneath their hooves. The Mongols. To the people of Japan, the Mongol name sounded like a storm on the horizon. Tales reached the shores of how they had conquered China, reduced kingdoms to dust, and demanded tribute from every land they touched. For the proud warriors of Japan, the samurai, this was both a warning and a challenge. They were no strangers to war, but what was coming was of another scale entirely. It began with emissaries. Mongol envoys, stern and unyielding, brought messages demanding submission. "Bow to the Khan," they said, "or face the wrath of his armies." In the court of Kamakura, the words struck like lightning. The shogunate, under Hojo Tokimune, refused. For the samurai, honor was not negotiable. Submission was unthinkable. The envoys were dismissed, their threats carried back across the sea. Perhaps, some thought, this would be the end of it. But the Mongols were not a people to be ignored. Far to the west, fleets were gathering. Soldiers, tens of thousands strong, drawn not only from the Mongol heartland, but from the Korean peninsula and the conquered regions of China. The armada that set sail was not just Mongol, it was a storm forged from many peoples united under one relentless ambition, to bring Japan to its knees. Their ships cut through the waves, black silhouettes on the horizon, carrying warriors clad in armor unfamiliar to the Japanese eye, bearing weapons that glinted with strange promise and deadly purpose. And yet they did not break. Sword met spear, arrow met armor, and the shoreline turned into a churning chaos of men and blood. Samurai leapt into the fray, cutting through soldiers with precision and fury, determined not just to fight, but to prove their spirit unyielding. The Mongols pressed hard, their numbers overwhelming, but Japan was fighting on its own soil, and every warrior knew he defended not just land, but ancestors, shrines, and the very soul of his people. As night fell, the Mongols retreated to their ships. their plan to regroup and strike again with fresh dawn. The Japanese forces, battered but unbroken, prepared themselves for what they knew would be an even greater trial. But then the sea itself intervened. Out of the darkness, winds began to howl. At first a steady breeze, then a gale, then a full storm. The heavens opened and rain lashed down, the sea tossing like a beast enraged. Mongol ships, built quickly and pressed into service, were no match for the fury of the typhoon. Waves shattered hulls, winds snapped masts, and soldiers who had braved 1,000 battlefields found themselves helpless against the ocean's wrath. The Japanese watched from the shore as the storm tore the invaders apart. Flames flickered across the sea where lightning struck, and cries of men were swallowed by the roar of the typhoon. When dawn broke, the water was littered with wreckage, splintered ships, broken weapons, bodies carried by the tide. The mighty force that had come to conquer had been scattered, undone not by sword or spear but by nature itself. To the samurai, this was no accident. It was divine intervention. Kamikaze, the divine wind. It became legend, a sign that the gods themselves had risen to protect Japan. The Mongols had seemed unstoppable, horsemen of the apocalypse who swept across continents. Yet here, at the edge of the world, their power had been broken. But even in victory, unease lingered. The Mongols were not a people who accepted defeat easily. They had lost this battle, yes, but their empire still stretched across the known world and their gaze was far from turned away. Japan knew this was only the beginning.